Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I offer my most grateful thanks to participate to this event and also especially to Mark Donfried. Now, cultural diplomacy, we had a wonderful presentation yesterday around music, and only those with the experience of music can immediately describe or indeed sing a pentatonic scale. So if you will indulge me, dee, 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 is a pentatonic scale. Yet, if we play with these notes a little, dee, 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 we're into a Scottish tune, that of Auld Lang Syne. This tune is recognised globally in Japan, India, Bangladesh, the Netherlands, Russia, the United States and Denmark. It's claimed as their own by the Chinese, yet it was fragments of this tune that Scotland's national poet Robert Burns set to words in 1788. Now, there cannot be a more tangible example of a nation punching above its weight where a folk tune stemming from the 18th century forms the part of its earliest cultural diplomacy strategy. Now, Burns Nights are now celebrated internationally. Indeed, I understand one is being held here in North Macedonia. And it's said that, excluding religious icons, there are more statues of Robert Burns around the world than any other well-known figure except Christopher Columbus. In the Scottish Parliament, I'm the convener of the cross-party group for St Andrew's Day, and we're turning our attention to how we can also ensure this day is celebrated internationally. St Andrew's has been the patron saint of Scotland since the 14th century and is indeed patron for many other countries, including Ukraine, Russia, Romania and Barbados. And it's estimated that around 44 million people throughout the world already identify with St Andrews and the cross of St Andrews, the flag of Scotland. Scotland is one of the oldest nations in Europe. Its boundaries have been fundamentally unchanged since the 15th century, and few countries can claim this territorial integrity. And I would argue that Scotland's been using cultural icons for centuries to facilitate cultural diplomacy, and that this longevity, or brand awareness we might call it today, is a critical part of both Scotland's reach and her success. Scotland's well known for its art and culture, and last month marked the end of the Edinburgh International Festival. It brought performers from as far afield as India, South Africa, Venezuela, Japan and Palestine. And one of this year's themes was a perspective that's not one's own. And this brings me to the second point of what I term the golden thread underpinning the cultural diplomacy adopted by Scotland. The ability to see ourselves as others see us, as Robert Burns said, yields powerful insights, and it's fundamental to how we use our soft power. Now, we know that international trade breaks down barriers, and yet Scotland's much more than a place evoking thoughts of bagpipes, mountains, tartan, and whisky. Modern-day Scotland excels in a multitude of sectors, including university education, fintech, and exports of food and drink, where provenance and quality are the watchwords. Prior to being elected to the Scottish Parliament, I undertook some primary research into Scotland's global business diaspora. And we were interested in finding out more about the sentiment towards Scotland of those who had left our shores, who claimed Scottish ancestry, or even just felt significant warmth to Scotland, what we termed affinity Scots. And the study included participants from 74 countries with over 1,000 respondents. Now, of course, it yielded a lot of data and key insights, but what stood out for me was the common theme of how Scotland was regarded as a place to do business, and the Scots as a people to do business with. Now, we've got a long history of trading nation going back many centuries, and indeed traded with the Balkans in the 15th century. But fundamentally, we are seen as ethical, trustworthy and hardworking. And it is these trust factors in today's world that open doors and, of course, facilitate trade. Add to them integrity, authenticity and ethics, and we have a set of values that transcend cultural barriers. Now, I would argue that Scotland can draw on a long history of these values. For example, the Scottish investment trusts and life companies established a tradition which can be seen today in the DNA of our investment firms, long-term approach to investment and a responsible attitude to governance, and Edinburgh's financial sector is regarded as honest, stable and indeed somewhat conservative. And that reputation, disappointingly, was threatened when much of the activity moved to the City of London, where its lax governance became really evident in the financial crash of 2008. So this ethos is another part of the golden thread that allows Scotland to punch above its weight. And our major firms have agreed significant growth by placing these principles at the very heart of their investment identities. This year, you may know, is the tercentenary year of Adam Smith's birth, a Scot and one of the founding fathers of economics. Born in Kirkcaldy, a small town located in the east coast of Scotland, baptised in 1723, he's best known for his book, The Wealth of Nations. He was the leader of the Scottish Enlightenment, which produced a quite remarkable outpouring of thinking across multiple disciplines: engineering, chemistry, political economy, medicine, and other areas of intellectual life. Scotland was taken to the world. And it's no coincidence that in the 1760s, Voltaire, whom Smith visited many times in France, said, "We look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization." And the Scottish Enlightenment asserted the importance of human reason and a rejection of any stance that couldn't be justified by reason. Yet it's his earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, from which I personally draw the most, and which underpins our golden thread of Scottish cultural diplomacy. In it, the concept of us as social beings capable of acting with morality is expressed as what he calls sympathy. And Smith describes it thus: to feel much for others and little for ourselves, to restrain our selfishness and exercise our benevolent affections constitute the perfection of human nature. And I would like to claim that we can track these global values as a feature of modern-day Scotland. My final thread talks to this year's theme, and I suggest a role for smaller nations based on the approach Scotland is already taking. I'm a board member of a humanitarian organisation, Revive Campaign, and it advocates for the victims of explosive violence. And through this conference, Ukraine is on all our minds, and yet much of the discourse is on the conflict rather than the outcomes, and particularly the life-changing and scars for the most innocent of victims. Revive has ensured that contemporaneous research has already been undertaken on the impact of the conflict. Now, of course, this is normally done afterwards, but this study has captured some unique insights in time. The report that we produce highlights, of course, practical difficulties for refugees, language barriers, adapting to cultural barriers in host countries, and so on. Yet more importantly, from the outset of any conflict, trauma is being created, and we know that effective and speedy treatment leads to the most positive outcomes, and before symptoms can be deeply embedded and indeed become intergenerational. And of particular interest to me is the impact on women and children, of whom the impacts of war disproportionately impact. The report notes, and I quote, "Often a conflict's gender dynamics reflect sexist social norms. Men are expected to fight and women are expected to flee." So trust, that important word again, in the bond of family relationships is so vital to developing a healthy child, and therefore putting in place early interventions is absolutely vital. So Scotland, although a smaller nation, can use its reputation based on longevity and trust factors, and I am calling in Scotland for an international conference to look now at the impact and put in place international measures to support it. So I wanted to make my last couple of points, and that is the role of women in cultural diplomacy. It's something that hasn't come up as yet in this conference. And in some respects, I would challenge us to all think about how our traditional approaches to cultural diplomacy can truly be gender aware. And as we know, women are just not equally represented in diplomacy or ambassador roles, and the elite patriarchal structures still dominate in many parts of the world. There are too few women at the top table of negotiations, and the way fundamentally in which negotiations are conducted is still masculine in form too often, when we know that creativity and flexibility rather than brinkmanship yields better results. Before I leave you, I want to express my regret at the limitations placed on Scotland in making her voice heard on the world stage. And perhaps it's remarkable that Scotland sings so loudly in many of the traditional areas around cultural diplomacy, yet must do so as a nation that is not a state. Our formal channels to undertake cultural diplomacy are limited, yet the Scottish Government aims to maximise its soft power and influence. And limitations such as Brexit are producing such cultural harms for us, particularly for our musicians, who are increasingly finding it hard to travel and to come together with other fellow musicians. But I return to my fundamental point around Brexit. It is trust that facilitates good relationships and cultural diplomacy, and Brexit has fundamentally undermined trust in the UK. Scotland will continue to draw on the values we hold dear, those values that are in our DNA, as we navigate the new challenges of our times. Indeed, one of them, as we know, artificial intelligence, our Scottish Artificial Intelligence Alliance has as its strapline, trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive. So this DNA, this thread, this golden thread, as I like to call it, remains with us still. So as a member of the Scottish Parliament, one of the longest lived of all global nations, and whom I hope once again will be a state, my hope is that Scotland can take its rightful place in leading cultural diplomacy based on the values that transcend borders. Thank you.